Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the amendment that I proposed to offer in the debate over the ISO amendment that has now gone on to the underlying bill that grants a concealed weapon permit to the federal judges, the Article 3 judges. And I supported the ISO amendment, but for members of Congress to not be included in that, I think was a glaring omission. In particular, when I look back at most of us remember where we were at some cataclysmic times in our lives, and maybe the assassination of President Kennedy for some of us. I remember where I was the day I got the news that Gabby Giffords had been shot and the others had been killed in Arizona. I was sitting live on a Fox News network doing an interview when that came in my ear and said, "She's been shot. Would you care to comment?" And I didn't have 30 seconds to gather my thoughts. It was a shock to all of us to see that happen to her, and I'm grateful that she's survived, and our prayers have been with the victims. Steve Scalise and the others that were shot on the ball field that the chairman alluded to a few minutes ago, and had we not had the Capitol Hill police there to defend them, and as aggressively and skillfully as they did, they were sitting ducks on that ball field, and I don't think anybody thinks there had been very many survivors if that shooter had been allowed to continue, if they hadn't been interrupted by the Capitol Hill police. But without the leader there, without the majority whip there, there's no security team there. No security team there meant no weapons there. Had any of those members had a right to carry and go back and forth across the river from into Virginia out of the District of Columbia and back again, it might have been what could have saved them under different circumstances. And I happen to know at least one member in this committee was departing that ball field right then. And so and for us, we've turned in a number of death threats over the years. I've lost track of how many, but I know that we've turned in a great, we've turned in substantially more in the last several months than we have prior to that. The confrontations that take place on the streets in America between members of Congress and irate citizens have gone up dramatically. And I mentioned a judge that had his wife and his daughter brutally murdered. We've watched members of Congress have been more targets than judges have on a percentage basis, on a per capita basis. And by the way, members of Congress are cleared for a security to walk into the White House without going through the metal detector, to walk aboard Air Force One without security, walk up to the First Lady or the President, because our backgrounds have all been checked by let's say, the eye of the public. And this amendment also would be consistent and comport with a bill that was introduced by Brian Babin that would have granted this right to carry to members of Congress, House and Senate. And so that's what the amendment does. It includes members of Congress into the underlying bill so that there would be a right to carry regardless of what which their state of residence is. That defines it. I urge its adoption, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman?
I'm happy to yield.
Yeah, I support the gentleman's amendment. I already considered myself and you and others persons, but we'll make it eminently clear since not everybody is sure of that. So I support the amendment. Proposed gentlewoman from
to strike
California
the last
State
word. First, I want to comment on our former colleague, Gabby Giffords. What happened to her was a terrible thing. I think we all remember when we heard the news. However, I think it's important to note that the organization which she founded, Giffords Courage to Fight Gun Violence, opposes this bill. And I would like to ask unanimous consent to put into the record several items from the Giffords organization, a fact sheet, Myths versus Facts, a fact sheet, Federally Mandated Concealed Carry Reciprocity, as well as a letter from the Giffords organization about the law enforcement coalition in opposition to the bill.
Without objection, they will be made part of the record.
I'd just like to note, Gabby, when she was a member of Congress, she was a remarkable person and lived and had in Arizona, had been a rural person. She rode a horse, she shot a gun. I mean, she had a lot of spunk. And I would note that had she wanted to have a concealed weapon permit under Arizona law, she could have done so. She wouldn't need this amendment to do that. For whatever reason, she chose not to do that. And I think it may be that even though she was someone who could do skeet shooting, she also had a recognition that gun violence was a danger in our country. And all of her activities since she was the victim of that terrible assault have been in that effort to keep our country safe, to prevent other people from being victimized, as she was, by someone with an assault weapon. In terms of reviewing what happened to her, it's pretty clear that had she, in fact, had a concealed weapon, it wouldn't have saved her from that assault at all. I would just like to say one other thing. One of the things that the public really hates is when members of Congress ask for special treatment. You know, people think we ought to live under the same laws as everyone else.
Would the gentlewoman yield?
I will in a minute. I think to single out members of Congress and federal judges, I grant you that, for special treatment is completely at odds with what the American public is expecting from us at this time. I think the amendment is a mistake. I think it is improper in terms of elevating our status above that of other Americans. And I think it is inconsistent with really the only member of Congress in my 23 years who's well, no, I'll take that back. But Ms. Giffords has led the way against this bill, and although I haven't talked to her about this amendment, given her opposition to the overall bill, I'm sure she would also oppose this amendment.